Morning, kids. It is Tuesday, our very last day of first grade. I'm so proud of you guys and all of your hard work this year, and you'll find a little more of all of that in our Read Loud video for today called Last Day Blues. But before we go ahead and read the very last chapter in Hotel for Dogs, I want to remind you of two things. The first one is that today, between 9 a.m. and 12 o'clock, which is around lunchtime, I'm going to be dropping by each of your houses to deliver your end of the year gift. It's a really fun bag full of some goodies and some treasures for you to have to remember first grade. So I hope to see you at that time. Second, if you can't join us for that, we will have our regular Tuesday night Zoom call tonight at 6:45. It's our very last one, and it's going to be a really fun celebration of first grade and ending the year together. Now, let's go ahead and jump into our last chapter of Hotel for Dogs. It took Mr. Walker exactly 10 minutes to get home from work after Mrs. Walker called him. Since his office was normally a 20-minute drive away, it seemed to the children that the only way he could have made the trip so quickly was to have flown. He still seemed to be flying as he leaped out of his car and strode up the sidewalk and into Aunt Alice's house. His face was grim, which means like serious, as he glanced about at the little group assembled in the living room. What in the world has been going on here? You'd better ask your son and daughter that question, Mrs. Walker said as calmly as she could. It seems they have turned the empty house down the street into a dog hotel. There are 9 dogs there now. At least there were at last count. One of them happens to be the Gordons' long-lost dog. A dog hotel. Mr. Walker repeated the words as though they had been spoken in a foreign language. He turned to Bruce, who was seated on the end of the couch. What is all this about, son? I think you'd better come up with a good explanation. Well, Bruce said slowly, how exactly had it all started? I guess the beginning was with Friday. Friday is mine, Andi said. At least, I was the one who found her. She ran in the night that it was raining while you were dripping on the carpet, and she had puppies upstairs in the sewing room closet. She had puppies here? Aunt Alice's eyes went wide. There were a dog and puppies right here in this house? Well, we got them out as fast as we could, Andi said. We didn't want you to start sneezing. And then when Bruce found out about the vacant house and that Jerry Gordon had knocked out all the windows, what? Mr. Gordon, who was seated in the chair by the window, straightened up with a jerk. He was a big man and handsome like Jerry, but there was a look of kindness in his face that could not be found on Jerry's. My son Jerry broke windows? Why wasn't I informed? I didn't think you'd believe it, Bruce told him. Tim Kelly said you never believe anything bad about Jerry. But the windows were out, and the house was empty, and when Red ran away and we found him, and he was hurt and scared, Andi said. Annie loved Bruce. And then Andi and Debbie came home with McTavish, and the Bulldales were going to be taken to the pound. Once they were started, they could not stop. The story had been building within them for so long. Now it came out, pouring like a stream rushing down a mountain, and by the time they were finished, Andi was crying again, and Bruce was biting his lip to keep it from shaking. Preston the Beagle was our only paying customer, he ended. Delaney's father is paying $5 a day for us to keep him. We needed that money. The food costs have been quite high. I imagine they have been, Mrs. Walker said. This sounds like a pretty expensive thing. 9 dogs is not a small family. It's more than just food, Andi said. Now that things were out in the open, it seemed that he might as well know the worst. We have to pay to get your projector fixed. It's smashed and the cord's gone out of it. That cord was from your father's projector? Mr. Gordon asked her. A light of understanding came into his eyes. Things are beginning to fall in place now. You wouldn't happen to have a color picture of Red Rover anywhere around, would you? Yes, sir, Bruce said. It's in my jacket pocket. Bruce is a wonderful photographer, Andi said. The picture looks just like Red. Jerry thought so too, Mr. Gordon said. The thing as I see it, broke in Mr. Crabtree, remember Mr. Crabtree is the one showing them the house, is that this is a clear case of breaking and entering, of damage and vandalism. I hardly think that, said Aunt Alice. She spoke in a very businesslike manner, very unlike her usual nervous flutter. The children did not break, and they merely entered. The breaking had already been accomplished. As for damage and vandalism, I certainly didn't see any signs of any. The inside of the house was clean and in excellent repair. That is hardly the point, Mr. Crabtree said. As I see it, a house standing open with no panes in the windows is an open invitation to children, Aunt Alice continued as if she had not heard him. It is what is legally termed as an attractive nuisance, and is the owner's and realtor's responsibility. The only possible charge that might stand up in court is trespassing. She paused, and then seeing the confusion on Mr. Crabtree's face, she continued in a gentler tone. My husband was a private detective, and I worked with him and ran his office for many years. We had many fascinating cases and were in court a number of times. I have a good fund of legal knowledge. Andi looked at her father's aunt with astonishment. You never told us. You never asked, dear, the white-haired woman said. Well, trespassing, then. That's bad enough, Mr. Crabtree said. What if I had taken a different buyer to see that house? How could I have explained all those animals jumping out from all directions? I certainly would have lost the sale, and my client could have even had heart failure. But that didn't happen, Mrs. Walker reminded him. Nobody had heart failure, and you didn't lose a sale. In fact, I think you may have made one. The point is, Mr. Crabtree stopped. He stared at Mrs. Walker. I beg your pardon? I don't think I quite understood you. I said you may have made a sale. Mrs. Walker turned to her husband. It's a really lovely house, dear, with nice big rooms and 2 bathrooms and a fireplace. With some hard work next summer, the yard could be made quite beautiful. The location is good, Mr. Walker agreed. It's close enough to my work and near Aunt Alice. I'm willing to take your word about the inside being what we're looking for. If the price is right, I'm sure it will be. Mr. Crabtree looked as though a miracle were happening. The owners are extremely anxious to sell. Of course, we might not be able to make a down payment if we have to pay a fine for our children's trespassing, Mr. Walker said. I have to agree with my aunt that charge is justified. Oh, I don't think the owners will press charges, Mr. Crabtree said quickly. In fact, under the circumstances, I see no reason for even telling them. Since the property in question will be yours soon anyway, we can just consider the children were looking it over. Which brings us to the next issue, the dogs, said Mr. Walker. I guess you're going to make us get rid of them, Andi said. I guess I certainly am. There was no sympathy in her father's voice. 9 dogs and then Bibi? You still want to keep Bibi? Of course I want Bibi, cried Andi. I love him. I love her. I wouldn't give her up for anything. But I love Friday, too, and they would have such good times together, and there's so much room at the hotel. 2 dogs, Mrs. Walker spoke softly. That's not so terribly many. I had 2 dogs when I was a little girl. Tim will take McTavish, Bruce said. I'm sure he will. And Andi and Debbie are training the Bulldales for the circus. Though, he added with honesty, they haven't learned any tricks yet. They're funny, but they're not very smart. We're not going to keep them until they do learn, Mr. Walker said decidedly. Tomorrow we put an ad in the paper. Christmas is just a month away, and people always want puppies at Christmas time. You'll pay for the ad too, kids, until every last one of those animals is gone. When the telephone rang, Aunt Alice went to answer it. When she came back, she said, Andi, it's for you. If it's someone with a dog, Mr. Walker said as Andi got up from her chair, don't you dare say we'll take it. I won't, she promised. I'll pay for the ad, Dad, Bruce said. I'll pay to have the projector repaired, too. I've got money put aside. I was saving it. He swallowed hard. I was saving it to buy Red Rover from the Gordons. And what made you think that dog was for sale? His father asked him. I didn't. I knew he wasn't. Bruce looked down at the floor. He could not meet his father's eyes. He didn't want anyone to see that his own eyes had tears in them. He wasn't for sale at the time, Mr. Gordon spoke up from his chair, but he is now. Bruce looked up. What did you say, sir? Red Rover is for sale, Mr. Gordon repeated. Jerry isn't ready for the responsibility of a dog. When a boy wakes up at night to a ghost, he can come out with confessions he wouldn't think of making in broad daylight. I learned a lot about my son that night, a lot that I should have known before. He shook his head sadly. There were people who tried to tell me Jerry had problems, and I should have listened. I should have opened my eyes. It's just that when it's your boy and you love him, you don't want to admit to yourself that he's less than perfect. We're all less than perfect, Mrs. Walker said. Children have to be taught the rules of living, and there are a lot of those that our own two haven't yet learned. But they know the basic ones, kindness and sharing, Mr. Gordon said. Jerry doesn't, and it's not entirely his fault. He's an only child, and his mother and I have tried to make up to him for that. We couldn't give him a brother or sister, so we kept giving him things. But Red isn't a thing, Bruce said. He's an awesome dog, and he deserves an awesome home with an awesome master. He does, Mr. Gordon agreed, and I'm going to see that he gets one. Would you still like to buy Red Rover? I can't afford that, Bruce said. I owe too much money already. I'll be willing to make up a payment plan, like where you pay a small bit each month. Mr. Gordon told him the important thing is to know that the dog is loved and well cared for. Dad? Mom? Bruce turned to his parents. 3 dogs? There was doubt in his father's voice. It's better than 9 dogs, Mrs. Walker reminded him. Guess what? Everybody, a voice spoke from the doorway. It was a funny, choked-up sort of voice that seemed to be trying to keep itself steady. Guess who you're looking at? There was a moment of silence. Then Mr. Walker said, Why, we're looking at a girl named Andrea Walker. He tried to speak lightly, but the words came out sounding strangely uncertain. The girl in the doorway was radiant, and her hands were clasped tightly before her. She looked like a person just waking from a dream. You're looking, she said, at Andrea Walker, the published writer. Andy! Mrs. Walker gave a cry of delight. You've sold a poem? Miss Crosno, my teacher, did it, Andy said in the same dazed voice. I turned it in by mistake, but Miss Crosno liked it. She didn't tell me, but she submitted it to the school paper. They're going to publish it in the Christmas edition. It's always just the 6th graders who write for the paper. They've never used a poem by a 5th grader before. Never, ever in the history of the school. But they won't pay you, will they? Bruce said. I thought the whole idea was that you wanted to earn money. Money? Andy said blankly, as though she had never heard the word. There are years ahead for earning money. Suddenly she was the old Andy again, talking and laughing. This is just the beginning, Bruce. Just the beginning. Her eyes were shining like stars. I'm not even 11 years old, and I'm ahead of Shakespeare. That is the end of Hotel for Dogs. So even though they got in trouble, and even though they weren't going to be able to keep all the dogs, they still were going to be able to keep a couple of them and make sure that the other ones had good homes. All right, guys, so this was the very last chapter of Hotel for Dogs. I can't wait to see you in just a little bit at your houses, and don't forget to join us tonight for our Zoom call. Bye, guys. I love you and I miss you.